We can just jump right in here. My goal today is really to share with you a little bit about spot buys, how they differ from tail spend, and then how technology in the procurement world is addressing these what we call spend cases or buy types across the procurement stack. So first, let's ask this kind of fundamental first principles question. Why do spot buys happen at large enterprises? Well, there's really kind of two reasons. One is that there is an emergency or urgent unplanned need. So this could be simply something that people don't see coming, which is why we get the fun stories of negotiating with a soccer player or buying something kind of unusual. But it could also be simply that the demand is unplanned. So we saw this, a lot of us working in supply chain saw this during COVID, where there was a huge surge in demand, especially in logistics. And we're going to talk about spot buying logistics in greater depth. But it's where the scope of a contract with a supplier has a certain foreseen demand or volume threshold, and the actual demand from stakeholders surges well beyond that. The other major case is simply spend where there isn't a lot of visibility into the spend to begin with. It's low criticality, low complexity, typically low dollar value and high frequency. And so and we can go to the next slide here. What is interesting about these two cases is they're often lumped together. However, due to this difference, spot buys are not equal to tail spend. Simply put, tail spend is often considered in the Kralik matrix, and some of those folks who learned supply chain back in the day are familiar. This matrix developed by Peter Kralik in a 1983 Harvard Business Review article. The four quadrants represent the supply risk and profit impact dimensions of spend. And actually, this is used in procurement to do a supplier segmentation exercise. In some cases, what's interesting is that for companies with significant direct materials or manufacturing spend, simply because an item is low in dollar value does not mean that it is low in risk. And so Ola Kalanius, chairman of the board of Mercedes-Benz, recently remarked, we have items that could be 75 cents or less than that, but if we don't have them, we're unable to sell a vehicle that could cost $75,000. So a low value item, but a high risk, and actually it has potentially high impact operationally. And you also see, just from a purely financial categorization, there can be spot buys that are unplanned. They can be incredibly high dollar value, as we heard in the recent case study from ARM Holdings. And so this is an interesting type of spend to think about, because one of the things we hear from procurement leaders and supply chain leaders is we want to use technology to become less reactive. We want to see around corners. We want to be more proactive. And what we want to discuss today in looking at spot buys analytically is what tools, techniques, and methodologies and approaches can we as a community and as a profession use to make spot buys strategic. Next slide, please. So we're going to look a little bit about the difference between these in constructing events. I'm not going to kind of go through each of these line by line in detail, but to say, for procurement professionals on the call, this is probably fairly familiar. Contract rates are typically long-term. There's typically a duration of the contract. It is supposed that the price will either be stable, or if it's changed, will only be changed in response to specific known and measurable market conditions. This is for specifically logistics. So we're just looking at This is an example here, but this construct exists in every major category of spend. It's set during a specific procurement event. It's usually favorable for the customer. It's given as a componentized price, so it's typically a complex price, and the performance of the supplier is relevant in managing the contract on an ongoing go-forward basis. In contrast, a spot buy or a spot rate is typically one-off, dynamic. You get a quote, you have to make a decision on it. It's favorable often for the supplier, in this category, the carrier. It's given in a simple one-off quote, and performance is hoped for, but not measured as rigidly or strictly. And in some cases, if we go to the next slide, please, this is because these spot purchases can be the result actually of unforeseen events. This is a graph showing billion-dollar disaster events over the past 40 years. And as we see, and it's not just COVID, by the way, people focus on COVID or the pandemic, but actually, if you look at the trend between 2010 and 2020, the data shows that these billion-dollar disaster events that in many cases have upended supply chain have dramatically increased in almost every major category of event, from extreme weather, geopolitical, a huge number of these. And this is part of the reason that increasingly, when you heard what Sean Park was saying about their strategic plan and transformation, at the top of that list was risk management. And increasingly, procurement and supply chain professionals are being challenged to not simply say, oh, well, what can we do? We can't control for these things, but to build in resiliency and capacity to manage risk, be agile, and pivot. And that's part of the reason that spot buys are such an important concept and such an important motion that people are investing in improving. Next slide, please. So let's look at a specific pricing dynamic that drives this. So how can spot buys be strategic? Well, it used to be, and when I was doing procurement consulting, everyone said, oh, maverick spend is the worst. It's the enemy. Let's get rid of as much maverick spend as possible. Spot buys can be classified as maverick spend. So ipso facto, they are a negative. However, one thing that happened, and as procurement and supply chain has evolved since the pandemic, this is a graph just in logistics of contract and spot market rates. And one of the things that happened is during the pandemic, if you were involved in buying logistics, you may remember this, because it got really weird for a few months. The spot market went way above contract rates. And what happened? Carriers said, I can sell the same freight load for significantly more than I committed to you. And so we're going to have to come back. We're going to have a meeting of the minds on what the price for this should be, or else, unfortunately, I'm going to be forced to sell my capacity at a higher rate. In certain cases, really tight supplier relationships, people said, okay, I'll keep some amount of my allocation, but it's a market economy and you have to go when the price moves that much. And so this really challenged a lot of people's thinking about how spot buys should be managed. And what we're hearing from logistics teams today is that they want to take advantage of short-term changes in the market. They actually want some amount of their spend to be in spot. And so that's a total paradigm shift from where it was even 10 years ago, where all maverick spend is bad and we want as much of our spend under contract with preferred suppliers as possible. Now people are seeing, wow, I can take advantage of changes in the market if I allocate a certain amount of my spend with forethought to the spot market. Next slide, please. And so as you can see, whereas traditional contract rates are pure leverage, with these changes, we're now seeing as volatility increases, and remember, you saw the slide about billion-dollar disaster events increasing. As volatility gets pushed into the market has to price in that volatility in its responses. Procurement teams are rethinking processes to take advantage of some of those changes. Next slide, please. And so how does this relate to predictive procurement orchestration? So one of the constructs that we think is really important is the idea that procurement can create competitive outcomes without necessarily a competitive process. What do we mean by this? The traditional construct of strategic sourcing involves supplier selection from a group of competitive suppliers that offer similar products at similar rates and similar performance. The traditional 7-step strategic sourcing process, as many of you well know, involves qualifying the suppliers before you do the price negotiation exercise so you can make sure they're honoring requirements, specs, and stakeholder say-so. What we have shown, and again, this goes back to the data that Neil shared with you earlier in the presentation. It goes back to some of the stories you've heard from customers and we'll hear from Patty at Dover. But what we have seen is that simply proposing and suggesting a completed offer, including price and other dimensions of the transaction, helps suppliers get faster, best and final offers sooner in the process. It effectively starts the negotiation at the end state or turns the process on its head by enabling collaborative feedback to make this a true win-win. Because what do suppliers want? They want faster procurement processes, more predictability in their sales cycles, and more efficiency in terms of knowing when they're going to be able to commit the demand. At the end of the day, the user is a human, right? We go back to this idea of human science. Salespeople, what do salespeople want? They want to make sales, right? And what do we as procurement people want? We want to provide them feedback so they know how to change their offers and ultimately get that type of outcome in real time. So I'm going to wrap it up just by sharing one last thing. Next slide, please. Is that this process aligns with the data science, game theory, and machine learning from every step of the process where data is involved, whether it's baselining, creating those relevant supplier cohorts, suggesting quoted offer. And we think of it as the enterprise procurement AI mullet, with the party in the front, in the email inbox with the suppliers, and the enterprise grade in the back, and with the collaborative feedback that really delivers that seamless one-click experience. We think a procurement process should be as easy as accepting a DocuSign. Next slide, please. And this really is where the future is headed, right? So as we're looking at events today, we have a big vision. You saw in Neil's presentation where that vision is going with the different components. But at the end of the day, it's about delivering across more spend, amplifying the impact of your team and the teams of the people working in this space to understand what the high and low of a pricing outcome is in the context of the holistic criteria: lead time, availability, supplier performance, risk, and then helping your team attain that more frequently across more spend, or as Neil likes to say, better outcomes faster at scale. Next slide, please. And I'll end off by just sharing a couple, and these are anonymized, recent spot buys. And one of the things that you can see is very fast cycle time, again, measured in a matter of days. And then in terms of the actual deltas in pricing, you see a few of these where it's dramatic. I mean, it's not just 20 and 30%. In some of these cases, it's a significant percentage. And you can see this across many different types of materials, spare parts that companies are buying, enterprise companies are buying at scale all the time. And so we see this, just to reiterate, this stuff works, right? It's a faster process. It's simpler, it's cleaner, it's clearer. And by the way, suppliers love it, because rather than having to do a dance and go back and forth over email and spreadsheets and keep iterating and revising, they have clarity earlier on that they're going to get the business or not. And then they can, move on to other things as is their benefit.